Miss Marple's tilted painting. The frame hid a fatal confession. Chapter 1. The Crooked Frame. The train to St. Mary Mead had been pleasantly uneventful, allowing Miss Jane Marple to knit half a scarf and ponder the letter that had summoned her to Harrow Manor. Lady Beatrice Harrow, an old-school friend, had written with her usual blend of warmth and vagueness, inviting Jane for a quiet visit to her countryside estate. But Jane, with her keen eye for the undercurrents of human nature, sensed something amiss in the overly cheerful tone. Beatrice's letters were never quite so effusive, unless she was nervous. As the carriage rattled up the gravel drive of Harrow Manor, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ivy-clad stone facade. The house was grand but worn, its elegance fraying at the edges like an old tapestry. Jane stepped out, her sensible shoes crunching on the path, and was greeted by a flustered maid who ushered her into the drawing-room. "Jane, my dear." Lady Beatrice rose from a velvet armchair, her silver hair catching the light. She was still striking, though her eyes darted with a restlessness Jane hadn't seen in years. "How good of you to come. You must be exhausted." "Not at all," Jane replied, her voice soft but alert. "The journey gave me time to think. And knit, of course." She held up her knitting bag with a smile, settling into a chair near the fireplace. The drawing-room was a study in faded opulence, heavy drapes, polished mahogany, and portraits of stern-faced Harrows glaring from the walls. But one painting, hung above the mantel, drew Jane's attention like a moth to a flame. It was a portrait of the late Lord Harrow, Beatrice's husband, his hawkish features captured in sombre oils. The frame, gilded and ornate, was unmistakably tilted, leaning to the right as if nudged by a careless hand. In a room so meticulously arranged, the crooked frame seemed almost deliberate. "Beatrice," Jane said, tilting her head to mirror the painting's angle, "that portrait seems a bit off-kilter, doesn't it?" Beatrice's teacup clinked against its saucer. "Oh, that old thing? It's been like that for weeks. The staff keep meaning to fix it, but—" She trailed off, waving a hand dismissively. "You know how these big houses are, always something needing attention." Jane nodded, but her eyes lingered on the painting. The tilt was subtle, yet it jarred the room's harmony, like a wrong note in a familiar tune. She might have dismissed it as a housekeeping oversight, but for the way Beatrice's fingers tightened around her cup, and the fleeting glance she cast toward the door. The butler, Mr. Grayson, entered with a tray of scones, his face a mask of professional calm. He was a tall man, nearing 60, with a slight stoop that suggested years of bowing to the Harrow family's whims. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" he asked, his voice smooth as polished wood. "No, thank you, Grayson," Beatrice said, a touch too quickly. As he turned to leave, Jane caught a flicker of unease in his posture, as if he were reluctant to linger near the mantel. The conversation drifted to village gossip and the weather, but Jane's mind was elsewhere. She sipped her tea, observing the room's details. The faint dust on the chandelier, the worn edge of the Persian rug, and, most of all, that stubbornly tilted painting. It was then that the maid, a young woman with nervous hands, slipped in to stoke the fire. Her eyes darted to the portrait, and she crossed herself before hurrying out. "Beatrice," Jane said, setting her cup down, "I couldn't help but notice the staff seem rather unsettled. Is everything quite all right? Beatrice hesitated, her smile faltering. Oh, it's nothing really. Just a bit of upset over poor Mr. Dawkins, our groundskeeper. He passed away recently, quite suddenly, in the rose garden. A heart attack, the doctor said. It's shaken everyone. You know how it is. Jane murmured her condolences, but her mind was already turning. A sudden death, a nervous household, and a painting that refused to hang straight. There was a thread here, waiting to be unravelled. She glanced at the portrait again, noting the way Lord Harrow's painted eyes seemed to follow her, as if guarding a secret. As evening fell and Beatrice excused herself to dress for dinner, Jane remained in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly. She rose and approached the painting, her fingers brushing the frame's edge. It was heavier than it looked, and the tilt felt oddly deliberate, as if someone had meant for it to catch the eye. Curious, she murmured, stepping back in the quiet of the room, with the fire crackling and the shadows lengthening. Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of a mystery. The crooked frame was more than a quirk. It was a clue, pointing to something hidden in the heart of Harrow Manor, and Jane Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, intended to find out what it was. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Gallery. The morning after her arrival at Harrow Manor, Miss Marple woke to the soft patter of rain against the leaded windows. The guest-room, with its heavy brocade curtains and four-poster bed, was comfortable enough, but Jane's thoughts were already elsewhere, on the tilted painting and the undercurrent of unease that seemed to permeate the house. After a light breakfast of toast and marmalade, she resolved to explore the manor further, her curiosity as sharp as the knitting needles tucked in her bag. Lady Beatrice was occupied with household matters, leaving Jane free to wander. She found herself drawn to the manor's art gallery, a long, dimly lit corridor on the second floor where the Harrow family's collection of paintings and curios was displayed. The butler, Mr. Grayson, had mentioned in passing that the portrait of Lord Harrow, the one now hanging crookedly in the drawing-room, had once resided here among its peers. Jane suspected the gallery might hold clues to its peculiar history. The gallery was a chilly, echoing space, its walls lined with portraits of Harrow's past, their faces rendered in stern oils and faded pastels. Gilded frames gleamed faintly in, the grey light filtering through tall windows, and the air carried the musty scent of old canvas and polished wood. Jane's footsteps were muffled by a threadbare runner as she moved slowly, her eyes scanning each painting for anything out of place. At the far end of the gallery, she paused before an empty space on the wall. A faint rectangle of cleaner plaster marked where a painting had once hung, and a small brass plaque beneath read, Lord Edmund Harrow, 1875-1923. This, Jane deduced, was the original home of the tilted portrait. She ran a finger along the wall, noting a thin layer of dust disturbed by recent movement. The painting had been relocated not long ago, perhaps within weeks. As she pondered this, a soft creak sounded behind her. Jane turned to see Mr. Grayson, standing in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was polite but guarded, like a man accustomed to keeping secrets. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "I trust you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," Jane replied, her tone mild. I was just admiring the gallery. Such a fine collection. I understand the portrait of Lord Harrow used to hang here." Grayson's eyes flickered to the hated empty space, and for a moment his composure wavered. "Yes, miss. It was moved to the drawing-room after his lordship's passing. Lady Beatrice thought it more fitting there." "An interesting choice," Jane said, tilting her head. "It's a striking painting, though it does seem a bit unsteady on the wall." The butler's lips tightened, and he adjusted his cufflinks with a practised gesture. "A minor oversight, I'm sure. The staff have been preoccupied since Mr. Dawkins' death. I'll see to it myself." Jane nodded, sensing his reluctance to linger on the subject. "Of course, and such a pity about Mr. Dawkins. He must have been a valued member of the household." "Indeed, miss," Grayson said, his tone clipped. "A good man, though he kept to himself. If you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." He bowed slightly and retreated, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Alone again, Jane resumed her inspection. She noticed a small side table nearby, its surface cluttered with old exhibition catalogues and a silver candelabra. Tucked beneath one of the catalogues was a scrap of paper, folded and creased as if hastily hidden. Jane glanced over her shoulder, then gently retrieved it. The note was written in a hurried scrawl. "The frame hides more than his face. Don't trust the roses." Her pulse quickened. The reference to the frame was unmistakable, and the roses could only mean the rose garden, where the groundskeeper Dawkins had died. Jane slipped the note into her pocket, her mind racing. Who had written it, and why hide it here? Was it a warning, a confession, or something else entirely? She continued her circuit of the gallery, her eyes now attuned to subtler details. Near the empty space on the wall, she spotted a faint scratch on the floorboards, as if something heavy had been dragged. Kneeling to examine it, she heard a muffled whisper from the adjacent corridor. A woman's voice, low and urgent. "Mustn't let her find it. She's too clever by half." Jane froze, her heart steady but her senses alert. The voice belonged to Clara, Lady Beatrice's daughter, whose sharp features and secretive manner had caught Jane's attention at dinner the previous evening. A second voice, male and indistinct, murmured a reply, but the words were lost as the speakers moved away. Rising, Jane smoothed her skirt and tucked the moment away for later reflection. The gallery, with its silent portraits and hidden notes, was a puzzle in itself, each clue pointing back to the tilted painting and the secrets it guarded. She made a mental note to speak with Clara, and to visit the rose garden where Dawkins had met his end. As she left the gallery, the rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, and the manor seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple's unassuming figure moved through the corridors, her mind weaving connections like the threads of her knitting. The crooked frame was no accident, and the whispers in the gallery were only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Groundskeeper's Secret. The drizzle had cleared by mid-morning, leaving the grounds of Harrow Manor damp and glistening under a pale sun. Miss Marple, dressed in her sensible coat and sturdy shoes, set out to explore the rose garden, where the groundskeeper, Mr. Dawkins, had met his untimely end. The cryptic note from the gallery, "Don't trust the roses," weighed heavily in her pocket, its words a quiet drumbeat urging her forward. She carried her knitting bag, as always, though her hands were free, her eyes sharp for any detail the garden might yield. The rose garden lay behind the manor, a walled enclosure fragrant with late blooms and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Trellises sagged under the weight of climbing roses, their petals scattered like confetti across the gravel paths. Jane paused at the garden's entrance, noting a wooden bench where a groundskeeper might have rested. Beyond it, a patch of disturbed soil marked the spot where Dawkins had been found. His body slumped as if he'd simply sat down to die. Jane's lips pursed slightly. A heart attack, the doctor had said, but the note and the household's unease suggested otherwise. She stepped carefully along the path, her gaze sweeping the ground. The garden was meticulously tended, yet she spotted a few anomalies. A broken rose stem, a scuff mark in the gravel, and, near the fatal spot, a faint imprint that looked like the edge of a boot. Too small for a man like Dawkins. As she crouched to examine the imprint, a shadow fell across the path. She looked up to see Tom, the young under-gardener, a lanky lad with dirt-stained hands and a wary expression. He clutched a pair of pruning shears, his knuckles white. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here. You looking for something?" "Just taking a stroll," Jane said, her tone light but her eyes keen. "Such a lovely garden, though it must be hard to maintain without Mr. Dawkins. I understand he was quite skilled." Tom shifted his weight, glancing toward the manor. "Aye, he was. Knew every plant by name. Terrible, what happened. Dropped dead, just like that." He snapped his fingers, but the gesture lacked conviction. "Very sudden," Jane agreed, rising. "Did he seem unwell before? Or perhaps troubled?" Tom hesitated, his gaze darting to the roses. "He was quiet lately, kept to himself. Always sketching in that notebook of his, though. Said it helped him think." "Sketching?" Jane's interest sharpened. "What sort of sketches?" "Plants, mostly. Roses, trees. But he was funny about that book. Never let anyone see it. Kept it locked in the shed." Tom pointed to a small wooden structure at the garden's edge, its door weathered but sturdy. Jane nodded, filing the information away. "Thank you, Tom. I'll let you get back to your work." As the boy shuffled off, Jane made her way to the shed. The door was secured with a rusty padlock, but the hinges were loose, and a gentle tug revealed a gap just wide enough to slip a hand inside. She hesitated. Meddling wasn't her style, but the note's warning and the tilted paintings. Mystery justified a small indiscretion. With a quick glance to ensure she was alone, she reached in and felt along the inner shelf, her fingers brushing a leather-bound notebook. The shed's dim interior smelled of soil and oil. Jane opened the notebook, its pages filled with meticulous drawings of roses, hedges, and garden layouts. But toward the back, the sketches changed. There were detailed studies of the tilted painting's frame, its ornate carvings rendered with almost obsessive precision. Beside one sketch, Dawkins had scrawled, "Heard it in the hall. Confessions in the frame. Must tell someone." Jane's breath caught. The groundskeeper had known something. Perhaps overheard a conversation about the painting's secret. She turned the page and found a rough drawing of the rose garden, with an X marked near the bench. Beneath it, in the same hurried hand, "Check the roses. It's not what it seems." Before she could read further, a sharp crack sounded outside, a twig snapping underfoot. Jane tucked the notebook into her bag and stepped out, her expression serene. Clara Harrow stood at the garden's edge, her dark eyes narrowing as she adjusted her shawl. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice cool, "I didn't realize you were so fond of gardening." "Oh, I find it quite instructive," Jane replied, smiling. "The roses are lovely, though I imagine they demand a great deal of care. Poor Mr. Dawkins must have been devoted." Clara's lips thinned. He was competent enough. A pity he overexerted himself. She gestured toward the manor. "Mother's expecting you for tea, shall we?" Jane inclined her head, sensing Clara's desire to steer her away. As they walked back, she glanced at the rose garden, her mind turning over the notebook's revelations. The confession in the frame, the mark in the roses, it was all connected, and Dawkins had paid the price for his knowledge. Back in the manor, as Clara disappeared upstairs, Jane slipped into the library to examine the notebook further. Tucked between its pages was a torn photograph, showing the tilted painting's frame being pried open by gloved hands. The face of the person was missing, ripped away, but the image confirmed what Jane had begun to suspect. The frame was no mere decoration. It was a hiding place, and its secret had cost a man his life. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her knitting needles clicking softly as she thought. The groundskeeper's secret was a thread in a larger tapestry, one she would unravel stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Canvas. The late morning light filtered through the drawing-room's tall windows, casting a soft glow on the tilted painting above the mantel. Miss Marple stood before it, her head cocked slightly, studying the portrait of Lord Harrow with the same quiet intensity she might apply to a particularly tricky knitting pattern. The frame's persistent tilt was no longer a mere curiosity. The groundskeeper's notebook and the torn photograph had confirmed it as the linchpin of a deeper mystery. Today Jane intended to probe further, and an opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. Lady Beatrice had invited a local art restorer, Mr. Percival Wren, to Harrow Manor to assess some of the gallery's older paintings. Jane, ever the unobtrusive guest, had gently suggested he take a look at the tilted portrait as well, citing its unfortunate angle as a matter of aesthetic concern. Beatrice had agreed, though her hesitation was palpable, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief as she gave her consent. Mr. Wren arrived promptly at 11, a wiry man with spectacles perched on a sharp nose and a leather case brimming with tools. He stood before the painting, his head tilted to mirror its slant, and let out a low hum of interest. "A fine piece," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Mid-19th century, I'd wager. The brushwork's quite distinctive, but this frame, curious, it's been left askew." "Indeed," Jane said, her voice mild as she settled into a nearby armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly. "I wondered if there might be something amiss with the canvas itself. Perhaps it's not hanging properly." Wren's eyes gleamed with professional curiosity. He stepped closer, running a gloved finger along the frame's gilded edge. "Could be. Let's have a look." With Beatrice's reluctant nod, he carefully lifted the painting from its hook and placed it on a cloth-draped table. The room seemed to hold its breath as he worked, the only sounds the rustle of his tools and the faint crackle of the fire. Jane watched closely, noting the faint scratches she'd glimpsed before. Irregular marks along the frame's inner edge, as if someone had pried at it. Wren's brow furrowed as he examined the canvas, his magnifying glass hovering over the surface. There's some discoloration here behind the frame, and these scratches, not typical wear, almost as if someone tried to lift the canvas from its stretcher. Lift it? Beatrice's voice was sharp, her posture stiffening. Whatever for? It's just an old portrait. Possibly to conceal something, Wren said absently, then caught himself, glancing at Beatrice's strained expression. That is, sometimes artists paint over earlier works, or hide sketches beneath. Common enough in older pieces. Jane's needles paused, her eyes flicking to Beatrice. The lady of the manor was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sure it's nothing of the sort," Beatrice said, her tone brittle. "This painting is a family heirloom, Mr. Wren. I'd prefer it not be disturbed further." "Of course, my lady," Wren said, but his gaze lingered on the canvas, clearly reluctant to abandon his discovery. He tapped the frame gently, producing a hollow sound that made Jane's pulse quicken. "The frame itself is unusually heavy. Might be reinforced, or—" He trailed off, sensing Beatrice's growing agitation. Jane interjected smoothly, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Perhaps we could leave it for now, Mr. Wren. I'm sure Lady Beatrice has enough on her mind without us dismantling her husband's portrait. Though it is fascinating, isn't it? The idea of something hidden beneath." Wren nodded, packing his tools with a touch of regret. "Fascinating, yes. If you change your mind, my lady, I'd be happy to examine it further. Could be a pentimento, a hidden layer. Rare, but not unheard of." As Wren departed, Jane remained in the drawing room. Her knitting resumed, but her mind racing. The scratches, the hollow frame, the discoloration, all pointed to the painting as more than a mere portrait. The groundskeeper's notebook had mentioned a confession in the frame, and now Wren's observations suggested the canvas itself might conceal a secret layer. But Beatrice's reaction was telling. Her insistence on leaving the painting untouched spoke of fear, not sentimentality. Jane rose and approached the painting, now rehung but still stubbornly tilted. She studied Lord Harrow's painted face, his eyes stern and unyielding. The canvas seemed to hum with secrets, its shadows deeper than they ought to be. She recalled the torn photograph from Dawkins' notebook, the gloved hands prying at the frame. Someone had known what lay hidden, and had gone to great lengths to keep it so. A soft footfall broke her reverie. The maid, Elsie, stood in the doorway, her hands twisting nervously. "Beg pardon, miss," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard you talking about the painting. It's not right, is it? The way it hangs. Mr. Dawkins, he noticed it too. Kept saying it wasn't an accident." Jane turned, her expression gentle but her eyes sharp. "Did he now? And what else did Mr. Dawkins say about it?" Elsie glanced toward the hall, lowering her voice further. "Just that it was wrong. Said he saw someone fiddling with it late at night before he died. I thought he was imagining things, but now—" She trailed off, her face pale. "Thank you, Elsie," Jane said, her tone reassuring. "You've been very helpful." As the maid scurried away, Jane returned her gaze to the painting. The shadows on the canvas seemed to shift, as if whispering of the confession they concealed. Miss Marple's mind stitched together the clues, the scratches, the hollow frame, Dawkins's suspicions, and Beatrice's fear. The tilted painting was a silent witness, and Jane was determined to make it speak. Chapter 5. The Locked Study. The afternoon at Harrow Manor was cloaked in a restless quiet, the kind that follows a storm of unspoken tensions. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, moved through the corridors with the unhurried grace of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. The tilted painting, with its scratched frame and hidden secrets, had pointed her toward a new thread in the mystery. Lord Harrow's study, a room Beatrice had mentioned only in passing, and always with a tightening of her lips. Jane had learned, from Elsie the nervous maid, that the study remained locked since Lord Harrow's death, its key kept under Beatrice's watchful eye. Such secrecy, Jane mused, was rarely without cause. As she descended the grand staircase, Jane encountered Elsie, polishing a brass candelabra in the hall. The maid's eyes darted up, wide with the skittishness of a startled deer. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "you're not poking about, are you? Only Lady Beatrice doesn't like folks wandering." "Oh, I'm far too old for wandering," Jane said, her smile disarming. "But I did wonder about Lord Harrow's study. Such a fine room, I imagine. Does no one use it now?" Elsie's hands stilled on the candelabra. "Not since his lordship passed, miss. It's locked tight. Mr. Grayson checks it now and then. But Lady Beatrice says it's to stay as it was. For memory's sake, she says." Her tone suggested she believed otherwise. Jane nodded, her mind turning. Memory is a precious thing, though I suppose it could use a bit of airing out. Damp can do such damage to old books and papers. Elsie bit her lip, then leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. I could show you, miss. I know where the spare key's kept. But you mustn't tell anyone. I'd lose my place." "My lips are sealed," Jane said, her eyes twinkling with encouragement. She followed Elsie to a small anteroom off the main hall, where the maid retrieved a key from behind a loose panel in the wainscoting. The girl's hands trembled as she handed it over, and Jane offered a reassuring pat on the arm before sending her back to her duties. The study was at the end of a quiet corridor, its oak door solid and unyielding. Jane turned the key with a soft click, and the door swung inward, revealing a room frozen in time. The air was heavy with the scent of leather and old paper, and a large mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with ledgers, an inkstand, and a faded photograph of Beatrice in her youth. Shelves lined the walls, groaning under the weight of books and rolled maps, while a single window admitted a sliver of grey light. Jane closed the door behind her and began her inspection, her movements methodical. She started with the desk, flipping through the ledgers with care. The entries detailed the manor's finances, and even a cursory glance revealed troubling patterns, mounting debts, dwindling rents, and large unexplained withdrawals in the months before Lord Harrow's death. One entry caught her eye, a payment to an AL for services rendered reframe. Jane's pulse quickened, the tilted painting again, its shadow stretching even into this locked room. She moved to the photograph, noting the way Beatrice's younger self gazed out with a confidence absent in the woman now. Behind the frame, tucked into the backing, was a folded note in Lord Harrow's angular script, If the truth comes out, the family is ruined. The painting must stay as it is. Jane slipped the note into her pocket, her mind stitching it to the groundskeeper's sketches and the art restorer's hints of a hidden layer. As she reached for a locked drawer in the desk, a sudden noise froze her. A faint scuffle, like footsteps pausing outside the door. Jane held her breath, her hand hovering over the drawer. The sound ceased, but the air felt charged, as if the room itself were watching. She waited, her heart steady, until she was certain she was alone again. The drawer yielded to a hairpin from her bag, revealing a small ledger marked private. Its pages listed transactions with cryptic notations. To A.L. for silence, and frame altered as agreed. The final entry, dated a week before Lord Harrow's death, read, "No choice left, confession secured, but at what cost?" Jane closed the ledger, her thoughts racing. The painting's frame was not just a hiding place. It was a vault for a confession that threatened the Harrow family's legacy. But who was A.L., and what role had they played in this web of secrets? The groundskeeper's death, the tilted frame, the financial ruin, all were threads in the same tapestry, and the study was its loom. She was about to replace the ledger when a sharper sound broke the silence. A creak from the corridor, unmistakable now. Jane slipped the ledger back, locked the drawer, and moved swiftly to the door, her knitting bag clutched like a shield. She opened it to find the corridor empty, but a faint scent of lavender lingered, the same perfume Clara Harrow favoured. Jane locked the study and returned the key to its hiding place, her expression serene but her mind alight. The locked study had yielded its secrets, but it had also raised new questions. Someone was watching her, and the tilted painting's confession was growing more dangerous by the hour. As she made her way back to the drawing room, Miss Marple's needles clicked in her bag, a quiet rhythm to match the steady unravelling of Harrow Manor's mystery. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Unease. The following morning, Miss Marple decided to venture into the village of St. Mary Mead, a short walk from Harrow Manor. The discoveries in Lord Harrow's study, the ledger's cryptic entries, and the note about a confession had deepened the mystery surrounding the tilted painting. The groundskeeper's death and the household's nervous silences pointed to a secret that reached beyond the manor's walls. Jane, with her knack for gleaning truths from casual conversations, resolved to visit the village vicar, who had officiated Lord Harrow's funeral, and might know more about the family's hidden burdens. The village was a picturesque cluster of thatched cottages and cobblestone lanes, its heart the ancient stone church of St. Mary's. Jane found Reverend Thomas Finch in the vestry, sorting hymnals with a distracted air. He was a slight man in his 60s, with a gentle face creased by years of listening to his flock's troubles. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Jane, as if he'd been expecting her. "Miss Marple," he said, setting the hymnals aside. "A pleasure to see you. Lady Beatrice mentioned you were visiting. I trust you're enjoying your stay at the manor." "It's been most illuminating," Jane replied, her tone light but her eyes keen. She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. "I've been admiring the manor's art, particularly a portrait of Lord Harrow. It seems to hold a special place in the family's heart." The vicar's hands stilled, and he adjusted his spectacles. A nervous habit. "Yes, the portrait. A fine likeness, I'm told. Lord Harrow was a complex man, much loved, of course, but not without his burdens. Jane's needles clicked softly as she began a new row. Burdened, was he? I understand you conducted his funeral. It must have been a difficult time for the family. Reverend Finch nodded, his gaze drifting to the vestry's stained-glass window, where light painted the floor in jewelled hues. Very difficult. His death was sudden. A riding accident, you know. The family was devastated, Lady Beatrice especially. She insisted on a private service, just the household and a few close friends. And did Lord Harrow share any concerns with you before his passing? Jane asked, her voice gentle but probing. I've heard whispers of a confession, perhaps something weighing on his conscience. The vicar's face paled, and he clasped his hands tightly. A confession? Well, I suppose it's not unusual for a man to reflect on his life in his final days. Lord Harrow did visit me a week before the accident. He was troubled, spoke of mistakes made long ago. But he was vague, said only that he'd taken steps to protect the family, even if it meant hiding the truth. Jane's needles paused, her mind stitching the vicar's words to the note in the study. The painting must stay as it is. Hiding the truth, she repeated softly. That's a heavy burden indeed. Did he mention anything about the portrait, or perhaps the manner itself? Finch hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of a hymnal. Not directly, though during our talk he kept glancing at a sketch he'd brought, a rough drawing of that very portrait. Said it was a reminder of his duty. I thought it odd, but he was in such a state I didn't press him. Jane's pulse quickened. Another sketch, like those in Dawkins' notebook. And this sketch, do you still have it? The vicar shook his head. He took it with him. I haven't seen it since. But, Miss Marple, I must caution you. The Harrows are a proud family, and some truths are better left buried. I've seen the strain on Lady Beatrice, on Clara, even young Roland. Whatever Lord Harrow meant to confess, it's brought them nothing but grief. Jane nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind racing. You're quite right, Reverend. Grief can cloud even the clearest truths. Though I did hear your sermon last Sunday. Something about truth hidden in plain sight. Most thought-provoking. Finch, flushed, caught off guard. Did you? Well, I suppose I was reflecting on the manor's troubles. The groundskeeper's death, you know. Poor Mr. Dawkins. It stirred up old rumours, and I thought a reminder of honesty might ease things. Rumours? Jane tilted her head, her voice as soft as a breeze. About the manor, or the family? The vicar shifted uncomfortably. Just village talk. Some say Dawkins knew something about Lord Harrow's death, that it wasn't an accident. Others whisper about the painting, how it's cursed or some such nonsense. I don't put stock in it, but the village is uneasy. Jane thanked him, rising with a smile that belied the storm of thoughts in her mind. As she left the church, the vicar's words echoed, truth hidden in plain sight. The tilted painting, with its scratched frame and hollow sound, was no mere heirloom. It was a confession in itself, and Lord Harrow's sketch, now lost, had been a clue to its meaning. Dawkins had known something, perhaps overheard the same confession the vicar hinted at, and it had cost him his life. As Jane walked back to the manor, the village's quiet charm felt deceptive. like a calm sea hiding treacherous currents. The vicar's unease, his vague allusions to Lord Harrow's guilt, and the missing sketch all pointed to a secret the family was desperate to keep. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked in her bag, a steady rhythm as she wove the clues together, each stitch bringing her closer to the truth behind the tilted painting. Chapter 7. The Frame's Hidden Compartment. The evening at Harrow Manor was heavy with the promise of rain, the sky a bruised purple beyond the drawing-room's windows. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving with their usual rhythm, though her mind was far from the scarf taking shape in her lap. The vicar's revelations about Lord Harrow's troubled conscience and the missing sketch had tightened the threads of the mystery, all leading back to the tilted painting above the mantel. Its crooked frame, with its scratches and hollow sound, seemed to pulse with secrets, and Jane was determined to uncover them. Dinner had been a strained affair, with Lady Beatrice's forced cheer doing little to mask the tension among the household. Clara's sharp glances, Roland's sullen silence, and the distant cousin Evelyn's nervous chatter had only deepened Jane's suspicions. The painting's presence loomed over the meal, its tilt a silent accusation no one dared acknowledge. As the family dispersed, Beatrice to her rooms, the others to their own distractions, Jane seized her chance to examine the portrait undisturbed. The drawing-room was quiet, save for the fire's soft crackle and the distant tick of a grandfather clock. Jane rose, setting her knitting aside, and approached the painting. Lord Harrow's painted eyes seemed to follow her, stern and unyielding, as she ran a finger along the frame's gilded edge. The scratches noted by the art restorer, Mr. Wren, were faint but deliberate, concentrated near the lower right corner. She pressed gently, testing for the hollow sound Wren had mentioned, and was rewarded with a faint, resonant thud. Her pulse quickened. The frame was more than it seemed, and the groundskeeper's notebook had hinted at a confession hidden within it. Jane glanced toward the door, ensuring she was alone, then retrieved a small hairpin from her bag. With the precision of one accustomed to untangling knots, she probed the frame's carvings, searching for a catch or seam. The wood was intricately wrought, its scrolls and flourishes perfect for concealing a mechanism. After a moment, a soft click sounded, and a narrow panel in the frame's lower edge sprang open, revealing a shallow compartment no wider than a letter. Jane's breath caught as she reached inside, her fingers closing around a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. She eased it out, careful not to tear the brittle edges, and unfolded it under the firelight. The letter was in Lord Harrow's angular script, its ink faded but legible. It began abruptly, as if written in haste. To whom it may concern, I can no longer bear the weight of my silence. The truth must be known, though it will ruin us. In 1918, I made a choice that cost a life taken not by my hand, but by my cowardice. The evidence lies with A.L., and the painting guards it still. Forgive me, Beatrice, for what I've done. The letter ended there, unsigned, as if Lord Harrow had been interrupted or lacked the resolve to continue. Jane's mind raced, stitching the letter to the clues she'd gathered, the ledger's payments to A.L., the vicar's talk of a confession, and the groundskeeper's sketches of the frame. The confession was incomplete, but its weight was clear. A crime, a death, and a secret tied to the painting. But who was A.L., and what evidence did the canvas still guard? Before she could ponder further, a sharp gasp broke the silence. Jane turned to see Elsie the maid frozen in the doorway, a tray of tea trembling in her hands. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her eyes wide. You found something, didn't you? Oh, I knew that painting was trouble." "Hush, Elsie," Jane said, her voice calm but firm as she folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. "No need to fret. Just a bit of dust behind the frame, that's all. Set the tea down and run along." Elsie obeyed, though her glance darted to the painting, fear etched in her face. As she scurried out, Jane heard hurried footsteps in the hall, followed by Clara's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone unseen. The drawing-room's door was ajar, and Jane caught a fragment of the conversation. "Can't let her? Keep poking about. That letter." The words cut off as the speakers moved away, but they were enough. Jane's heart steadied, her resolve hardening. The letter's discovery had rattled the household, and Clara's involvement suggested she knew more than she'd let on. Jane closed the frame's compartment, ensuring it clicked shut, and adjusted the painting to its familiar tilt. For now, she'd keep the letter's existence to herself, letting the family believe their secret was still safe. As she returned to her chair, picking up her knitting, the firelight cast long shadows across the room. The tilted painting seemed to watch her, its confession now partly revealed but far from resolved. Miss Marple's needles clicked, a quiet counterpoint to the storm brewing in Harrow Manor. The frame had yielded one secret, but the canvas, and the truth it guarded, remained, a mystery she was determined to unravel. Chapter 8. Motives in the Morning Room. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds, casting a muted glow over Harrow Manor's morning room, where breakfast was laid out with the precision of a ritual. Miss Marple sat at the polished table, her knitting bag at her side, observing the Harrow family with the quiet attentiveness of a spider in its web. The discovery of Lord Harrow's partial confession, hidden in the painting's frame, had sharpened her focus. The letter's mention of a life taken and a mysterious A.L. pointed to a crime that still haunted the household, and Jane suspected the family's strained dynamics held the key to unravelling it. Lady Beatrice presided over the table, her silver hair immaculate, but her hands betraying a faint tremble as she poured tea. Her son Roland, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a perpetually furrowed brow, buttered his toast with unnecessary force. Clara, sharp-eyed and composed, sipped her coffee, her gaze flickering to Jane as if measuring her. Evelyn, the distant cousin, chattered nervously about the weather, her laughter too bright for the room's heavy mood. The tilted painting, though in the drawing-room, seemed to cast its shadow here, its secrets unspoken but palpable. Jane nibbled a scone, her voice soft as she broke the silence. "Such a charming room, Beatrice, and such a fine view of the Rose Garden. It's a pity about poor Mr. Dawkins. He must have taken great pride in it." Beatrice's teapot wavered, a drop spilling onto the cloth. "Yes, a pity," she said, her tone clipped. "He was reliable. The garden hasn't been the same since." Roland snorted, setting his knife down with a clink. Reliable? The man was always skulking about, muttering to himself. Probably drank too much and collapsed. No great loss. Roland! Beatrice's voice was sharp, her eyes flashing. That's unkind. Mr. Dawkins served us well. Clara's lips curved faintly, though her eyes remained cold. Mother's right, Roland. Let's not speak ill of the dead, though I dare say he was curious about things that didn't concern him. Like that painting in the drawing-room. Her gaze slid to Jane, a challenge lurking in its depths. Jane met Clara's look with a serene smile, her needles clicking softly in her lap. Curious, was he? I suppose old portraits do invite speculation. That one of Lord Harrow is quite striking, though its tilt is rather distracting. Evelyn laughed, a nervous trill. Oh, that tilt! I keep meaning to fix it, but every time I try, it just tilts again. Silly, isn't it? Almost like it's meant to be that way. Her words faltered under Clara's withering stare. Off, she busied herself with her marmalade. The exchange was brief, but it revealed fault lines. Jane sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing motives. Beatrice's defensiveness suggested she feared the painting's secrets, perhaps tied to the financial ruin hinted at in the study's ledgers. Roland's disdain for Dawkins hinted at a personal grudge, possibly linked to the groundskeeper's knowledge of the confession. Clara's pointed remark showed she was watching Jane closely, aware of the letter's discovery or suspecting it, and Evelyn, with her anxious chatter, seemed desperate to deflect attention, as if hiding her own stake in the mystery. The conversation shifted to mundane matters, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Jane noted Roland's clenched jaw when Beatrice mentioned the manor's upkeep costs, and Clara's quick glance at Evelyn when the subject of Lord Harrow's legacy arose. Each had a reason to guard the painting's secret. Beatrice to preserve the family's name, Roland to secure his inheritance, Clara to protect her own schemes, and Evelyn to maintain her precarious place in the household. As breakfast ended, Roland pushed back his chair abruptly. "I've got business in the village," he muttered, striding out. Clara excused herself with a cool nod, while Evelyn lingered, offering to help clear the table, a task Beatrice waved away. Alone with Jane, Beatrice's composure faltered, her fingers twisting her napkin. "Jane," she said quietly, "you've always been so observant. I hope you're not finding our little troubles too distracting. Families, you know, have their quirks." "Oh, I find quirks quite fascinating," Jane said, her tone gentle, but her eyes sharp. "They often reveal so much about a household's heart. Like that painting. It's almost as if it's trying to tell us something." Beatrice paled, her napkin crumpling. "It's just an old portrait, Jane. Nothing more." She rose, her smile strained, and left the room, leaving Jane alone with her thoughts. The morning room's quiet was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Jane's needles resumed their rhythm, each stitch weaving together the family's motives, greed, shame, fear, and secrets buried deep. The tilted painting's confession was a spark, and the Harrows were tinder, ready to ignite. Miss Marple knew the next clue would bring her closer to the truth, and to the danger lurking in Harrow Manor's shadowed halls. Chapter 9. The Art Dealer's Visit. The afternoon at Harrow Manor brought an unexpected visitor, stirring the household's uneasy calm like a stone dropped into still water. Miss Marple was in the library, perusing a volume of local history, when the sound of a motor car crunching on the gravel drive drew her to the window. A sleek black sedan had pulled up, and from it emerged a man in a tailored suit, his sharp features softened by a practised smile. Mr. Grayson, the butler, greeted him with a stiffness that suggested the visit was unannounced, or unwelcome. Jane returned to her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly, as Lady Beatrice swept into the hall to meet the newcomer. Through the open library door, Jane overheard snippets of their conversation. "Mr. Langley, quite unexpected, here to appraise?" Beatrice's voice was polite but strained, betraying her unease. Jane's curiosity sharpened. An art dealer arriving now could hardly be a coincidence given the tilted painting's growing significance. Moments later, Beatrice led the visitor into the drawing-room, where the portrait of Lord Harrow hung in its crooked glory. Jane followed at a discreet distance, her unassuming presence allowing her to slip into the room unnoticed. Mr. Langley, a wiry man with a hawkish nose and quick, assessing eyes, stood before the painting, his hands clasped behind his back. "Here, remarkable piece," Langley said, his voice smooth as polished oak. "Mid-19th century, yes? The brushwork suggests a follower of Reynolds, though the frame is later. Custom work, I'd say. Lady Beatrice, you mentioned an appraisal." Beatrice hesitated, her fingers twisting a pearl brooch. I hadn't planned on it, Mr. Langley. Your letter caught me by surprise. But since you're here, I suppose it's no harm to have your opinion." Jane's eyes narrowed slightly. Beatrice's claim of a letter seemed at odds with her evident discomfort, and Langley's arrival felt too timely, given the painting's hidden compartment and Lord Harrow's confession. She settled into a chair, her knitting resuming as a cover for her keen observation. Langley stepped closer to the painting, his gaze lingering on the frame's scratches, those same marks Jane had noted. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself. "This frame's been tampered with, and the tilt deliberate, perhaps." He glanced at Beatrice, who paled but said nothing. "Deliberate?" Jane interjected, her voice mild. "How intriguing. I'd assumed it was just a quirk of old houses. You must see many such paintings in your work, Mr. Langley." Langley turned, his smile tightening as he registered Jane's presence. "Indeed, Miss Marple," she supplied, her needles clicking. "Just a guest, fascinated by art. Have you come across this portrait before, or perhaps its maker?" Langley's eyes flickered, a shadow of caution crossing his face. "Not of this piece specifically, but I'm familiar with the Harrow collection. Lord Harrow was a discerning collector, though not without controversy. There was talk, years ago, of a forgery scandal tied to one of his acquisitions. This portrait, perhaps, or another in the gallery." Beatrice's teacup rattled against its saucer. "A scandal? Nonsense! My husband's collection was impeccable. I won't have such rumours stirred up." "Of course, my lady," Langley said smoothly, though his gaze returned to the painting, calculating. "But provenances can be complicated. If this piece were to come to auction, its history would need scrutiny, especially given those marks on the frame. They suggest alterations." Jane's mind raced, stitching Langley's words to the clues she'd gathered. The ledger's payments to A.L., the groundskeeper's sketches, and the confession hidden in the frame. Was Langley the A.L.? Lord Harrow had paid for silence, or was he fishing for the same secret Jane sought? His knowledge of the frame's tampering was too precise to be casual, and his uninvited arrival suggested an agenda. Before Beatrice could respond, Clara entered, her dark eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Mother, what's this about? An appraisal? We've no intention of selling Father's portrait." Her tone was sharp, her gaze locking onto Langley with suspicion. Langley raised his hands placatingly. "Merely an offer of expertise, Miss Harrow. Your father's collection is renowned, and I'd hate to see its value underestimated or its secrets overlooked." The word secrets hung in the air, and Jane noted the reactions. Beatrice's flinch, Clara's clenched jaw, and the sudden stillness in the room. Langley knew something or suspected it, and his presence was a catalyst, stirring the household's buried fears. As Beatrice ushered Langley out, promising to consider his services, Jane remained in the drawing-room, her knitting a steady rhythm. The art dealer's visit had cracked open new possibilities. A forgery scandal, a tampered frame, and a man too curious for his own good. The tilted painting's confession was tied to more than a family's shame. It might involve a crime that reached beyond the manor's walls. Jane glanced at the portrait, its crooked frame a silent challenge. Mr. Langley's parting glance. The painting had been one of greed, not admiration. Miss Marple's needles clicked, each stitch tightening the web around Harrow Manor's secrets. The art dealer was a new thread, and she would follow it to the truth. Chapter 10. Footprints in the Frost. The morning after Mr. Langley's unsettling visit, Harrow Manor woke to a crisp frost that dusted the grounds like powdered sugar. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, stood at her bedroom window, her breath fogging the glass as she surveyed the rose garden below. The art dealer's hints of a forgery scandal and his keen interest in the tilted painting's frame had added a new layer to the mystery. But Jane's thoughts kept circling back to the groundskeeper, Mr. Dawkins. His death in the rose garden, dismissed as a heart attack, felt increasingly like a loose thread, one that might unravel the painting's fatal confession. Bundled in, her woolen coat and scarf, Jane slipped out before breakfast, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder. The air was sharp, stinging her cheeks as she made her way to the walled garden. The frost crunched under her sensible shoes, preserving the ground in a delicate temporary clarity. She paused at the entrance, her eyes scanning the gravel paths and rosebeds for anything amiss. The bench where Dawkins had been found was dusted with frost, its surface undisturbed, except for a faint set of footprints leading from the manor's rear door to the garden's heart. Jane crouched, her breath catching. The prints were fresh, their edges crisp in the frost, and they were too small to belong to a man like Dawkins or even Roland. They veered toward the spot where the groundskeeper had died, then doubled back, disappearing into the grass near the manor. Someone had been here, perhaps last night, retracing the path of Dawkins' final moments. Following the trail, Jane noticed a glint in the frost near the bench. She knelt, brushing aside the icy crust to reveal a discarded paintbrush, its bristles stiff with dried pigment. The colours, ochre and umber, matched the tones of the tilted painting's frame, as if someone had used it to touch up or alter the wood. Her mind flashed to the scratches Mr. Wren had noted, and the art dealer's comment about tampering. The brush was no accident. It was evidence of recent meddling with the painting. Jane tucked the brush into her bag, her gaze returning to the footprints. They suggested a hurried visit, perhaps to conceal or retrieve something tied to Dawkins' death. The groundskeeper's notebook had marked an X in the rose garden, hinting at a clue hidden among the roses. She moved to the bed nearest the bench, her fingers brushing the thorny stems. Beneath a cluster of fading blooms, half buried in the soil, was a small metal tin, its lid rusted but intact. Her pulse quickened as she pried it open. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, its edges frayed. The handwriting was Dawkins', unmistakable from his notebook. Saw her by the painting. Midnight. Frame opened. She knows. The note was cryptic, but its implications were clear. Someone, likely a woman, had tampered with the painting's frame, and Dawkins had witnessed it. The her could be Clara, Beatrice, or even Evelyn, each with motives Jane had glimpsed at breakfast. Before she could ponder further, a shadow moved at the garden's edge. Jane slipped the tin and note into her bag, rising with a calm that belied her racing thoughts. Clara Harrow stood at the gate, her dark coat stark against the frost, her eyes narrowing as she took in Jane's position by the bench. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice cool but edged with suspicion. "You're up early. The garden's hardly at its best in this cold." "Oh, I find the frost quite revealing," Jane replied, her tone mild. "It preserves things so clearly, like footprints, for instance. Someone's been out here recently, it seems." Clara's expression flickered a crack in her composure. "Footprints? Likely Tom, the undergardener. He's always poking about." She stepped closer, her gaze darting to the rosebed where Jane had found the tin. "You're awfully interested in this garden for a guest." "It's a lovely spot," Jane said, smiling. "And poor Mr. Dawkins did so much for it, I thought I'd pay my respects in a way." Clara's lips thinned, but she said nothing, turning back toward the manor. "Breakfast will be served soon. You'd best not catch a chill." Her words were polite, but the warning beneath them was unmistakable. Jane watched her go, then retraced her steps to the manor, the paintbrush and tin heavy in her bag. The footprints, the brush, and Dawkins' note were new stitches in the mystery's fabric, pointing to a woman's involvement, and a frame altered under cover of night. The tilted painting was no longer just a clue. It was a beacon, drawing out the guilty and their secrets. Miss Marple's needles would have clicked had she been knitting, but her mind was already weaving, pulling the threads of Harrow Manor's fatal confession ever tighter. Chapter 11. The Confession Unveiled. The atmosphere in Harrow Manor had grown taut as a drawn bowstring, each member of the household moving with the wary precision of those who know a storm is coming. Miss Marple, her knitting bag a constant companion, had spent the day piecing together the clues that now formed a nearly complete tapestry. The tilted painting's hidden compartment, Lord Harrow's partial confession, the groundskeeper's cryptic notes, and the fresh footprints in the frost. The paintbrush and rusted tin from the rose garden had confirmed her suspicions. Someone in the manor was desperate to keep the painting's secret buried, and Dawkins had died for what he knew. By late afternoon, Jane decided the time had come to force the truth into the open. She requested Lady Beatrice gather the household in the drawing-room after tea, citing a desire to share a small observation about the painting. Beatrice, her face pale but composed, agreed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of dread. As the family assembled, Beatrice, Roland, Clara, Evelyn, and even Mr. Grayson hovering at the room's edge, Jane stood before the tilted portrait, its crooked frame, a silent accusation. "Thank you all for indulging me," Jane began, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of certainty. "This painting of Lord Harrow has been a puzzle since my arrival. Its tilt, you see, is no accident. It's a signal, pointing to a secret hidden within its frame, a secret that cost poor Mr. Dawkins his life." A murmur rippled through the room. Roland shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching, while Clara's gaze sharpened, her lips a tight line. Beatrice gripped the arm of her chair, and Evelyn let out a nervous giggle that died quickly under Jane's steady look. Jane continued, her tone measured. "I found a letter in the frame's hidden compartment, written by Lord Harrow himself. It speaks of a choice he made in 1918, one that led to a death, not by his hand, but by his cowardice. The letter mentions A.L., and evidence guarded by the painting, but the canvas itself holds more." She turned to the portrait, gesturing to its surface. Mr. Wren, the art restorer, noted discoloration and a possible hidden layer, a pentimento, he called it. "With your permission, Beatrice, I'd like to test that theory now." Beatrice's face drained of colour, but she nodded, her voice barely audible. "Do what you must." Jane had prepared for this moment, enlisting Mr. Grayson to fetch a small ultraviolet lamp from the Manor's collection of curios. As he set it up, the room's tension thickened, the family's eyes fixed on the painting. Jane switched on the lamp, its eerie glow illuminating the canvas. Slowly, beneath Lord Harrow's stern features, another image emerged. A faint outline of a document, its text ghostly but legible. "It's a contract," Jane said, her voice clear, dated 1918, between Lord Harrow and an Arthur Langley, A.L. It details a deal to forge a painting, sold to cover the Manor's debts. But the forgery led to a tragedy. A rival collector, swindled by the fake, took his own life. Harrow's cowardice was in staying silent, letting the blame fall elsewhere. Gasps punctuated the room. Roland swore under his breath, while Clara's hands twisted in her lap. Evelyn's eyes were wide, and Beatrice covered her face, a sob escaping her. Jane pressed on, her gaze sweeping the family. Mr. Dawkins overheard talk of this confession, likely between Lord Harrow and someone in this household. He saw the frame being tampered with, perhaps to hide or retrieve the letter. His notes and sketches prove he suspected foul play, and the paintbrush in the rose garden, its pigments matching the frame, shows someone recently altered it to keep the compartment hidden. She paused, her eyes locking onto Clara. "The footprints in the frost, Clara, were yours. Small, precise, leading to the rose garden where Dawkins died. You were seen by him midnight at the painting. You knew the confession could ruin the family or give you leverage over them." Clara's face hardened, but she said nothing, her silence louder than any denial. Beatrice's voice broke the stillness, trembling with anguish. "Clara, is this true? Did you harm Mr. Dawkins?" Before Clara could respond, Roland surged to his feet, his face red with fury. "This is nonsense. You're accusing my sister based on footprints and some old letter? Dawkins had a heart attack. Everyone said so." Jane's voice remained calm, cutting through his bluster. "Did he, Roland? Or was he poisoned? Perhaps with something slipped into his tea to silence what he knew. The confession threatens your inheritance, doesn't it? The manor's debts are still unpaid, and a scandal would bankrupt you all." Evelyn burst into tears, her words tumbling out. "I didn't want any of this. I only helped Clara move the painting once to check the frame. I didn't know about Dawkins." The room erupted, voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations and denials. Jane raised a hand, her presence commanding silence. "The confession is unveiled," she said, "but the killer is still among us. The painting has spoken, but it's your actions now that will reveal the full truth." As the family stared at the glowing canvas, the contract's ghostly text a testament to their shame, Miss Marple stepped back, her knitting bag at her side. The confession was out, but the danger was far from over. The tilted painting had done its work, and now the guilty would have to face the consequences. Chapter 12. The tilted truth. The drawing room of Harrow Manor was a crucible of raw emotion, the air thick with the aftermath of Miss Marple's revelations. The tilted painting, its hidden contract exposed under the ultraviolet glow, stood as a silent accuser, its crooked frame a testament to the secrets it had guarded. The Harrow family, Lady Beatrice, Roland, Clara, and Evelyn, sat or stood in stunned silence, their faces a gallery of guilt, fear, and defiance. Mr. Grayson lingered by the door, his usual composure frayed, while Jane Marple stood calmly before the mantel, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes sharp as she prepared to unravel the final thread of the mystery. "Miss Marple," Beatrice said, her voice trembling but resolute, "you've laid bare my husband's shame, but you accuse my daughter of murder. Surely you don't believe Clara capable of such a thing?" Jane's expression softened, but her tone was firm. "I believe, Beatrice, that the truth has a way of tilting things until they fall into place. The painting's confession points to a crime in 1918. But Mr. Dawkins' death is a more recent wound. Let us consider the facts." She gestured to the painting, its ghostly contract still faintly visible as the ultraviolet lamp flickered. "Lord Harrow's deal with Arthur Langley, the AL of his letter, led to a forgery that caused a man's death. The guilt of that act haunted him, and he hid his confession in the frame, hoping to protect the family. But Dawkins, a diligent man, noticed the painting's tilt, a signal, I believe, left by Lord Harrow himself to ensure the truth would one day surface." Jane turned to Clara, whose face was a mask of icy control. "Clara, you were seen by Dawkins at midnight, tampering with the frame. His note, found in the rose garden, confirms it. You knew the confession could ruin the family, or perhaps you saw it as leverage to secure your own future. The footprints in the frost were yours, and the paintbrush, with pigments matching the frame, suggests you tried to conceal the compartment's tampering." Clara's eyes flashed, but she remained silent, her hands clenched in her lap. Roland, however, could contain himself no longer. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, stepping toward Jane. "You've got no proof, just a note and some footprints. Clara's no killer, and neither am I. Jane raised a hand, her presence commanding despite her slight frame. Please, Roland, sit down. I haven't accused Clara of murder yet. But let us consider motive. The manor's debts, as I found in Lord Harrow's study, are crushing. You, Roland, stand to inherit a bankrupt estate unless the scandal is buried. Dawkins' knowledge threatened that. She turned to Evelyn, who was sobbing quietly. And you, Evelyn, admitted to helping Clara move the painting. Your place in this family is precarious, dependent on Beatrice's goodwill. Did you act out of loyalty or fear? Evelyn shook her head, tears streaming. I didn't know about Dawkins. I only helped Clara because she said it was to protect us all. Beatrice's voice cut through, sharp with desperation. Enough, Jane. You're tearing us apart. If there's a killer, name them. Jane nodded, her gaze steady. Very well. The tilted painting was a signal, but Dawkins' death was no accident. His heart attack was induced, likely by a poison, subtle enough to escape notice in a cursory examination. The rose garden, where he died, was a place he trusted, a place where someone could approach him without suspicion. She paused, her eyes settling on Clara. Clara, you had the opportunity. You were seen at the painting, and your footprints led to the garden. But motive alone isn't enough. The true killer needed access to Dawkins' habits, and his tea, which he took daily in the shed. Only one person in this household had that access and the knowledge to act. Jane's gaze shifted to Mr. Grayson, who stiffened, his face paling. Mr. Grayson, you checked the study, you managed the household, and you knew Dawkins' routines. You also knew of the painting's secret, didn't you? Lord Harrow confided in you, his trusted butler, about the confession. When Dawkins began asking questions, you saw the family's ruin and your own position threatened. The room gasped as Grayson's composure cracked, his hands trembling. That's preposterous, he stammered. I've served this family for decades. Indeed, Jane said, her voice calm but relentless. And you'd do anything to protect it. The paintbrush in the garden was yours, used to touch up the frame after you checked the compartment. The poison, perhaps foxglove, from the garden's own plants, was slipped into Dawkins' tea. You were in the hall when Clara spoke of the letter, and you acted to silence Dawkins before he could expose the truth. Grayson's shoulders slumped and he sank against the wall, his face ashen. I didn't mean for it to go so far, he whispered. Dawkins was getting too close. He'd have ruined us all. I only wanted to protect Lady Beatrice, the family. Beatrice's cry was anguished, and Clara's mask finally broke, her eyes wide with shock. Roland stared at Grayson, his anger giving way to disbelief. Evelyn's sobs filled the silence, and Jane stepped back, her work done. The tilted truth is out, she said quietly. The painting pointed the way, and Mr. Grayson's actions have confirmed it. The confession is no longer hidden, and justice can now take its course. As the family grappled with the revelation, Miss Marple glanced at the painting, its tilt a reminder of the truth's stubborn persistence. The mystery was solved, but the scars it left would linger in Harrow Manor's halls. Chapter 13. The Painting Restored. The morning after Mr. Grayson's confession, Harrow Manor seemed to exhale, its heavy air lightened by the unburdening of truth. The tilted painting, which had loomed over the household like a spectre, was taken down at Miss Marple's suggestion, its frame carefully straightened by Mr. Wren, the art restorer, who had returned at Lady Beatrice's request. The portrait of Lord Harrow, its hidden contract and confession now fully exposed, was rehung above the drawing-room mantel, its alignment perfect at last, a symbol of secrets laid to rest. Miss Marple sat in the morning-room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on the scarf that had accompanied her through the Manor's unravelling mystery. The family was subdued, grappling with the aftermath of Grayson's betrayal and the public airing of Lord Harrow's long-buried guilt. The butler had been taken into custody by the local constable, his quiet admission of poisoning Mr. Dawkins with foxglove from the rose garden sealing his fate. The confession, tied to a 1918 forgery and a rival collector's tragic death, had shaken the Harrows, but it had also freed them from the shadow of silence. Lady Beatrice joined Jane, her face weary but softened by a new-found resolve. She carried a tray of tea, setting it down with hands that no longer trembled. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "I don't know how to thank you. You've saved us, in a way, though it's cost us dearly." Jane set her knitting aside, her smile gentle. "The truth is a heavy thing, Beatrice, but it's lighter than secrets. Your family can rebuild now, without the painting's tilt to haunt you." Beatrice poured the tea, her eyes distant. Edmund's shame. I suspected he carried something, but I never knew the full weight of it. That forgery, that poor man's death, it explains so much. And Grayson, I trusted him. We all did. Trust is a fragile thread, Jane said, accepting a cup. Grayson acted out of loyalty, however misguided. He believed he was protecting you, just as Dawkins believed he was honouring the truth by noting the painting's secrets. Beatrice nodded, her gaze drifting to the window, where the rose garden lay quiet under a pale sun. "Clara's taken it hard. She's angry, at Grayson, at herself. She admitted to checking the frame, you know, after she overheard Edmund talking about the confession years ago. She thought it might give her leverage over Roland to secure her share of the estate. But she swears she didn't harm Dawkins. I believe her," Jane said, her tone firm. "Clara's ambition is clear, but her footprints in the frost were those of a searcher, not a killer. Evelyn, too, was caught in the web, helping Clara out of fear for her place here. And Roland, his bluster hid his own fear of losing the manor. They're all human, Beatrice, and humans err." Beatrice managed a faint smile. "You see so much, Jane. I suppose that's why you untangled this mess. What will you do now? Back to St. Mary Mead, I presume." "Indeed," Jane said, her eyes twinkling. "My garden needs tending, and my neighbours will be eager for a bit of harmless gossip. But I'll carry Harrow Manor with me, as I do all my little adventures." As they sipped their tea, Roland entered, his usual scowl softened by a grudging respect. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, I misjudged you. Thought you were just a nosy old spinster. But you've done us a service. The manor's debts are still a problem, but at least we're not hiding from the truth any more." Jane inclined her head, her smile serene. "Truth is a sturdy foundation, Roland. Build on it, and you'll find your way." Clara and Evelyn joined them briefly, their exchanges tentative but less guarded. The family was fractured, but the cracks were beginning to mend. The painting's restoration, a quiet promise of renewal. As Jane prepared to leave, Beatrice walked her to the hall, where the straightened portrait caught the light. "Jane," Beatrice said, pausing, "there's one thing I must ask. The painting? Do you think Edmund meant for it to be found? That tilt, it was so deliberate." Jane's eyes lingered on the portrait, Lord Harrow's stern face now free of its crooked burden. "I believe he did, Beatrice. Guilt has a way of seeking the light even through the smallest crack. The tilt was his confession's voice, and Mr. Dawkins heard it, as did I. Your husband's legacy is tarnished, but his truth has set you free." Beatrice's eyes glistened, and she clasped Jane's hand. "Thank you, Jane, for everything." As the carriage arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple glanced back at Harrow Manor, its stone facade softened by the morning light. L'écoute, tilted painting was restored, the fatal confession unveiled, and the family left to heal. Her needles clicked in her bag, a steady rhythm as she turned her thoughts to home. There would be other mysteries, other threads to unravel, but for now the truth had found its place, and Jane Marple was content.